All right, so in these notes, we're going to review macromolecules, which are a really important building block in the human body. Actually, just biology in general. So, we're going to review the functions and structures of the molecules that form the building blocks of tissues in our bodies. Macromolecules, all right? So, first we're going to review organic compounds and where macromolecules sits within that. And then we're going to review the major types of macromolecules. And in particular, we're going to make a deeper dive into lipids because that's just a really weird class of macromolecule. The other forms of macromolecules we're going to go into in more depth when it becomes relevant in later parts of our year. And as we go over macromolecules, these terms will come up. So, macromolecules are a type of organic compound. So what is an organic compound? Well, an organic compound is a molecule that's made with carbon. In particular, it's made of lots of carbon for a lot of organic compounds. Not all of them. Some can be very small, but a lot of them are quite large. And the reason why that is because carbon has the ability to form 4 bonds with each atom. So you can chain lots of carbon together. So one carbon can bond to a bunch of other carbon, which can bond to a bunch of other carbon, and they can bond to other atoms on them. But it just can get bigger and bigger and bigger as a basis of that. Now, the reason why that happens is because carbon has 4 valence electrons, which means each of its valence electrons can form additional bonds. Whenever a valence electron is alone, it can make extra bonds. VE is a shortcut for writing valence electrons. Hopefully that's familiar to you, but if you don't remember, that's what that is. Okay, so all macromolecules that we're going to discuss, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, those are all basically organic compounds because they rely on lots of carbon to help hold this molecule together. Now, in terms of organic compounds, they typically are made of these major elements in the body. Now, these elements got cut off in my slide, but it's basically carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are among the top 10 elements in the human body that you can see in this chart. I didn't list calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium and potassium because these are elements that are part of the body, but they're not typically found in organic compounds. They're usually found as ions floating around in different parts of your body. So how do macromolecules fit inside of this? So macromolecule is just a type of organic compound because it is made of carbon backbone with that huge amount of carbon chained together. But it is a macromolecule. Macro just means large. So when we say macromolecule, we just mean a really large molecule. But in terms of anatomy, we're really fundamentally referring to 4 major types of macromolecules: carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Most macromolecules are what we call polymers. So what they're made of is their molecules are made of tinier molecules chained together through covalent bonds. So you take a little part of the monomer and you chain them together. You may have heard proteins are made of amino acids, and amino acids are the tiny monomer that gets chained together to make the polymer. Not all macromolecules are polymers, though many are. However, lipids are a little funky. They're a macromolecule that's not a polymer. So you can kind of see it in this example. So this text is still the same as the last slide. So in this case, a polypeptide, which is the earlier form of a protein, you can kind of see this is repeating subunit, this is repeating subunit, this is repeating subunit. Yes, there's a little element of it that's slightly different, but fundamentally it's still NCC, NCC, NCC with the same HH double bonded O, HH double bonded O, HH double bonded O. So it's a repeating unit. On the other hand, if you look over here with this phospholipid, which is basically a lipid, one of the 4 types of macromolecules, this part doesn't look anything like this part, which doesn't look anything like this part. It is not repeating subunit, so that's how we know lipids are not polymers, even though, if you look at it, it's a pretty giant molecule. So these are the 4 major types of macromolecules. I'm going to go over each one, or each category one by one. So let's look at carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are sugars, or things that you know are sugary or bad for you. Basically, if you shouldn't eat it as a diabetic, it's a carbohydrate. So carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It's got a pretty decent amount of oxygen to each carbon. All right. When you see lipids over here, that little parentheses means it has oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon, but it's got a lot less oxygen. That's why I put in parentheses. Okay, so the tiniest unit of carbohydrates are basically the tiny sugars. Glucose is a classic example of a tiny sugar. Now, sugars basically are mainly used for energy in your body, and like if it's not actively being used as energy, it's being stored for future energy. Now, there are some instances where sugar ends up being used for other things. It's used sometimes to help balance the concentration gradients of water in your body, so you get a decent water balance. And especially it's found in your mucus to help make that stickiness. That's sugar. So these are examples of sugars. Anything that ends in ose, maltose, dextrose, those are all types of sugar. But these are the famous ones. Glucose, sucrose, fructose you may have heard of. Lactose is the sugar in milk. Starches and glycogens are also types of sugar. They may not taste sweet, but they're made of tinier sugars that are all chained together, and they just don't taste sweet because they don't fit on the sweet sections of your taste buds. But sugar, you can mix it in a glass of water and it'll dissolve, so we know it's water soluble, which means that it can be transported in anything watery in your body, including blood sugar. All right, lipid is fat, basically. Liposuction sucks out fat from your body. Lipids, liposuction, fat suction. Okay, so its subunits, its pieces are made of glycerol and fatty acids, generally speaking, though it can be made of slightly different subunits. That's why I'm going to go into lipids in depth, because there's all kinds of lipids, but a lot of them have fatty acids in them somewhere. Okay, so in this case, fats or lipids are associated with energy storage, insulation, keeping you warm, waterproofing, hormones. It's one of the types of hormones that your body can form. And in this case, examples are fats. Triglycerides is another term for fats. So any fat that you have, it's a triglyceride. When you think of, I have a lot of fat on my body, that's triglyceride. It's also waxes, phospholipids, which are found in cells, and steroids. Those are all examples of lipids. Proteins are the big dogs in your body. They're really critical for building the structures of your body and doing the work in your body. So, their elements typically are, I should have made a slightly better division here, but their elements that are found in the molecules are typically carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur, and they're made of amino acids. But their function is to build structures, to help power and speed up reactions. They're really critical for transporting things around your body or moving your body, even in addition to helping form some of the types of hormones your body uses. Examples of things you may have heard of: enzymes are made of protein. Some hormones are made of protein. Fibers, like muscle fibers in your skin, like collagen, all those things are proteins. In addition to that, they're really critical for defense in your body, like antibodies. Are they water soluble? Well, I forgot to go over that in lipids. Lipids are not water soluble. Think about it. Mixed fat with water, probably going to float somewhere, like oil and water. Proteins are so unique and capable of doing so many things because it's really dependent on some of the things that are attached to the protein. In bio, you should have learned there's different amino acids that help make up the protein, and in fact, all those amino acids have slightly different properties that ultimately affect whether or not they hang out in water or don't, which allows the protein to be really unique and do all the weird stuff it does. Finally, we have nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, okay? So they're made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus a lot of the time. And their subunit is nucleotides. Let's do that. And its job is to hold genetic information, and a big part of it is to also take that genetic information and provide instructions to make proteins. Examples of it are DNA, RNA, and I should even write down here ATP is another major example of this. It's a nucleotide too. Is it water soluble? Yes. So let's go over some pictures, and I encourage you to draw it out. So on that table, underneath at the bottom of the table, you should add little pictures of each thing. So at this point, I want you to add to your table or draw underneath your table kind of a rough diagram of examples of very basic versions of these macromolecules. Most of them are the monomers of the macromolecule, though I can't manage that with a lipid because it's so weird. You don't have to have it precise. You just kind of want to get the elements that make it clear. So, for example, here, it doesn't show in the image, but just a heads up, whenever there's a corner of a diagram that's unlabeled, that doesn't have a letter on it, that actually means that's a hidden carbon. These are all carbons on the corners. Okay? But anyways, just a really basic drawing of a carbohydrate. It doesn't need to be precise, but you should have like the ideal elements. Basically, carbohydrates have hexagons with carbons in the corner, and there's always an O somewhere on one of these corners. Okay? There's other stuff hanging onto it too, but this is the fundamental shape. Sometimes people get even lazier and write it out like that. Okay? Lipids, on the other hand, their shape starts with a backbone of carbons, kind of like that. Those carbons have a little bit of an O, oxygen stuck to them, and then they get more carbon here. And then after that, they just become a chain of carbon with hydrogens on it. You go as long as you want, but that's basically it. It doesn't have to be the cleanest, but you get the idea. You just should have C's and H's, and then kind of a CH weird thing along the other axis with O's kind of in the center. So at this point, I'm going to erase the pictures on the screen and move on to drawing proteins and nucleic acids. By the way, my lipid drawing kind of sucked, but honestly, if you just kind of want to draw a shorter version of the lipids and just kind of draw this out, if you're doing non-digital notes, you could do that. All right, so let's go over proteins. So with proteins here, basically it goes N, C, C. The last C always has a double bonded O. If it's not bonded to another NCC, then the final C has a single bonded O, or it's just connected to the next NCC. The middle C has one H, and then that R group here just means dealer's choice. So basically all amino acids, their difference is this little thing here. They can hang whatever other stuff they want there. Any element or mix of elements can be stuck on that corner. Finally, the final H has two hydrogens sticking off of it. Okay? So this is the fundamental structure of the protein amino acid. Finally, looking at the nucleic acids over here, their basic structure is a central sugar, some kind of a nitrogen ring. So just draw like kind of a ring here or something with N in it. The N is important. So it might be a double ring, but as long as there's an N in it, it's fine. And then finally, this corner over here is always stuck to a phosphorus group or a phosphate group. So sometimes people just write P like that, and other times people actually draw out the phosphorus group or phosphate group with one central P and four O's attached to it, then attached to the sugar. And don't forget, each sugar corner is a carbon, but sometimes people don't write the carbon in there. So here's some classic example of nucleic acids. This is what I mean by the carbon ring and then the phosphate on the corner and then some kind of weird ring with N inside of it. Nucleic acids are DNA, RNA, and you often see them in the nucleus of the cell. You don't have to write this part down in your notes. It's just as a reference. This one you don't have to write down either, but I think it's helpful since some of you are not familiar with what a carbohydrate is. So carbohydrates, these are some classic ones you'll be familiar with from your food. So monosaccharides are associated with really sweet sugars that tend to be very wet or syrupy. So honey, agave nectar, fruit juice, those are all examples of monosaccharides, and fructose and glucose. Disaccharides are sugars that are kind of crystal, or sugars that are sugar, but they aren't necessarily as sweet. Table sugar is a classic example of sugar. Lactose is the sugar in milk, stuff like that. All right, starchy foods are foods that are bad for people with sugar issues like diabetes, but the way they're chained together makes them not taste sweet, okay? Because they're giant rings of sugar all chained together, but they don't sit on your tongue, so they don't, in the sweet taste bud area, so they don't taste sweet. So, classic examples are bread, cereals, pasta, rice, beans, potatoes. Those are all carbs that are not sweet, polysaccharides. Glycogen is a form of sugar that's found in your muscle and liver, and whenever you have extra sugar in your body, you store it in your muscles and liver, and it's used as a reserve of sugar for the future. This sort of is a classic example of a super chained together carbohydrate. And proteins, they're just everywhere in your body. All right? They help your DNA and RNA be made, so DNA and RNA needs to be made for protein, but proteins help make more DNA and RNA. It's kind of a weird chicken and egg thing. They're needed for immunity with antibodies. They're used as enzymes, especially in your digestive system. They move things around like oxygen. They are really important hormones. They're just everywhere. Any motion you need to make, that's powered by a protein. But what we're going to dig in right now is into lipids, because lipids are the most diverse class of macromolecules. They look really different from one type to another. They can look really, really different. So let's go into one form. So when it comes to the subunit of fatty acids, you can have saturated and unsaturated fats. So in saturated fats, there's no double bonds in the CH region. Just reminding you, this section of fats, right? This section is the fatty acid, while this section over here is the glycerol backbone. So pointing at this corner over here. All right, so that chain can be no double bonds, and then ignoring the first O. And as a result, what ends up happening is there's no bend in the fatty acid, so they're actually more likely to pack up really densely and create really solid fats. So animal fat, bacon grease, butter, all the really delicious bad for you fats, those are saturated fats, and because they don't have extra bonds inside of the fatty acid tail, they end up packing densely, and they end up sticking and clumping together more easily inside your body. On the other hand, unsaturated fats, the ones that people think of as healthy fats, tend to stay liquid because within their fatty acid chain, they have a double bond inside of it, which creates a bend in the fatty acid tail, which means that the fats don't pack as tightly together, and they end up being more loose and more fluid. So olive oils, avocado oil, nut oils, all those are unsaturated fats. The fat in fish stays liquid even in the fridge sometimes. That's unsaturated fat. Sorry if I said saturated. Unsaturated fat, I mean. The ability for unsaturated fats to stay liquid at room temperature and saturated fats to stay solid at room temperature does make a difference. It'll make a difference in your body. If you want your body to be more solid, even when it's in areas that are warm, then you'll have more saturated fats in that area, like a membrane. On the other hand, if you want it to stay fluid and flexible, even when it's really cold, like cold water fish, then they'll want more unsaturated fat in their body to stay flexible. Okay, so within the cell membranes, they are made of something called phospholipids. So phospholipids are a special type of fat that has fatty acids, but on top of that, they have a phosphate on it, a phosphate ion on it. Okay, so what you have is you have your lipid. So we have our lipid backbone here with the fatty acid tail on it. So this is just a shortcut for drawing out the fatty acid tail. So fatty acid. And then what ends up happening is we end up taking our fatty acid. Sorry, that's written terribly. And we end up popping on a phosphate ion onto it. Okay? So People sometimes draw it out more simply than this, although I think this is pretty simple. And what they do here is you just draw a head with two squiggly tails out of it as their simplified version of a phospholipid. So phospholipids are found in the cell membrane. And what happens here is they have a hydrophilic end and a hydrophobic end. And that's going to let them form what's called our cell membranes, the things surrounding our cell. So the top end likes water. The tails over here are nonpolar and they hate water. So what ends up happening is in water, they form something called a bilayer of phospholipids. So this is just a cartoony version of what I drew out. Okay, so what is that bilayer? That bilayer ends up having the hydrophobic tails turn towards each other. So when we have our phospholipids, the fats, again, want to avoid the water that's surrounding them. So the water that's on the outside and inside is surrounding them. So the phospholipids end up creating this wall automatically that separates that, because they're trying to stay together, they end up creating this kind of fence by accident, and this fence just kind of ends up wrapping around in a circle, and it ends up like encasing the cell. So I don't want to draw the whole thing out, but you can kind of see how this can eventually bend and create a circle of just phospholipids, and then it ends up separating the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. And that ends up controlling what goes in and out of the cell, because stuff that likes water ends up having to pass this like great barrier, this great fence of stuff that hates water. So basically, if you like water, you're not going to automatically slip into or out of the cell. So as a result, things that are nonpolar, or if they're polar but very small, they can slip through, but things that are very large or have very strong charges can't. So can pass through hydrophobic stuff, meaning things that like fat, gases, small polar molecules, those will get through easily. Small polar molecules, including water. But things that are very large or very charged, they have to need assistance or effort, not conscious, but effort on behalf of the cell to want that stuff to pass through. This can include viruses, and this is a thing that's going to prevent viruses from entering the cell as easily. All right, the last special type of lipid we're going to go over is steroids. So this doesn't look anything like the other kind of lipids. There's no fatty acids. Instead, they do this weird thing where they're fused rings. They actually look a little bit like sugar rings, except, do you see here? None of the corners of the rings have O's in the corners. Unlike every sugar ring had an O in the corner, these do not. In addition to this, they kind of fuse in a weird way along a line. Sugars don't really do that. Sugars tend to have their O rings kind of use a separate line to kind of separate each other. Sorry, I'm bad at drawing sugar. But basically, sugar does that. But in this case with steroids, their rings kind of stick side by side. In addition to that, you don't see any O's inside the corners. You might see them on the edges, but you don't see them on the inside. So, in this case, they're still considered lipids because this huge section, because there's no O inside of it, it hates water, so it will not dissolve in water. So it's basically pretty nonpolar, able to mix into fat. So, classic examples of steroids are cholesterol. And cholesterol is actually the building block that helps turn into vitamin D and hormone steroids. Hormones include sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen, and also a special hormone called cortisol, which is one of the hormones related to stress. And if you forgot, hormones are signaling molecules that travel through your blood to float around your body. So, for example, the testosterone and estrogen made from your sex organs can float and induce puberty in other parts of your body when there's high amounts of those sex hormones. All right, so key takeaways. Macromolecules are large organic compounds that make up your body. Lipids are the only kind that are really not polymers, though, that are made of smaller repeating units. But the other three classes, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids, are. Carbohydrates are hydrophilic and a huge source of energy, while proteins can be hydrophilic or hydrophobic, but they're very important for creating unique structures and helping create mobility and all this other important work in your body. While nucleic acids mainly store information and help provide the information needed for proteins. Lipids are really unique and weird, though, because they're the only class of macromolecules that are hydrophobic. They're really useful for creating barriers around your body. And because they're barriers that don't like water, you also need lipids to form other molecules like steroids that can slip past those barriers. There's special types of lipids like fatty acid types, like saturated versus unsaturated, that are based on their structure that allow them to be more liquid or more solid. So they'll be found in different parts of your body according to their job. And finally, steroids, which we mentioned already, have a number of things that they can do. They can be cholesterol, or they can be really helpful for forming hormones. All right, on that note, that concludes the lesson. Move on to anything else. Bye.